Europe's most disciplined economy was never as indestructible as it appeared. For years, Germany was treated as the safe bet, the reliable exporter, the industrial engine, the country that proved order and efficiency could power prosperity indefinitely. Precision cars, immaculate factories, balanced budgets, and a reassuring sense that systems, once built, would simply keep working. Germany wasn't just an economy, it became a blueprint. Follow its rules, copy its methods, trust the model. But models age. Behind the polished exports and calm political language sat a series of quiet assumptions. Energy would stay cheap. Global demand would remain steady. Trade would remain neutral. Demographics could be managed slowly. Efficiency could substitute for flexibility. None of those assumptions failed on their own. They weakened together. Energy stopped behaving like a certainty. Export markets became political. Workforces aged faster than they could be replaced. An industrial system engineered for stability found itself exposed to volatility. And when the pressure arrived, layered, overlapping, and relentless, Germany didn't implode. It fractured, not in a way that made headlines overnight, not in a way that sparked panic, but just enough to raise an uncomfortable question across Europe and global markets alike. How resilient is an economy built to avoid disorder at all costs? This isn't a story about decline, and it isn't a celebration of failure. It's an examination of how one of the world's most admired economic systems ended up standing on far less solid ground than its reputation suggested. So today, we're pulling back the polished surface, not to predict collapse, but to understand vulnerability. And before we begin, if you enjoy documentaries that carefully dismantle comfortable economic myths, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Because algorithms, unlike industrial policy, do not reward patience. Now, let's begin. Germany did not look like a country headed for an economic reckoning. It looked like the adult in the room. While other nations lurched from crisis to crisis, Germany appeared calm, methodical, almost immune to chaos. Its factories ran on schedules so precise they felt eternal. Its exports flowed with mechanical reliability. Its political debates were technical, cautious, restrained. Nothing about Germany's economy suggested fragility, and that was a first illusion. For decades, Germany's success story felt less like a strategy and more like a law of nature. Precision engineering, disciplined labor unions, vocational training, and a deep respect for industry formed a system that seemed to reproduce prosperity automatically. Germany didn't need flashy startups or speculative bubbles. It made real things, sold them to the world, and collected the profits. Again, and again, and again. Over time, this consistency became a kind of national identity. Germans didn't boast about growth. They expected it. Stability was assumed, not debated. Economic policy became an exercise in maintenance, not imagination. Leaders focused on preserving balance, avoiding disruption, and smoothing rough edges. The idea that the system itself might need reinvention felt almost offensive. But stability has a dangerous side effect. It silences uncomfortable questions. Digital infrastructure lagged behind peers, but factories still worked, so urgency faded. Bureaucracy thickened, but employment remained high, so complaints were muted. Innovation slowed outside core industries, but exports still sold, so concern never reached panic. The machine was running, and as long as it ran, few cared how old its parts had become. Germany's leaders increasingly treated the economic model as something fixed, like geography. You didn't redesign the Alps, you adapted to them. In the same way, Germany's export-heavy, energy-hungry industrial system wasn't questioned. It was accepted. Yet beneath the calm surface, small stresses accumulated. Productivity gains narrowed. Investment slowed. Infrastructure aged quietly. Dependence on external conditions grew deeper. None of these were fatal on their own, but together, they formed hairline cracks, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The most dangerous assumption of all was that nothing fundamental would change, that global trade would remain open, that energy would stay cheap, that geopolitical tensions would remain manageable, that the world would continue to reward Germany for doing what it had always done, History has a habit of punishing those assumptions. Germany didn't fail to see risks. It chose to manage them slowly, carefully, politely, and by the time those risks stopped being theoretical, the system was already under strain. The illusion of permanence was not that Germany was perfect. It was that Germany believed time was on its side. It wasn't. Energy rarely makes headlines when it's cheap. It hums in the background, invisible and obedient. For Germany, energy was exactly that, an unseen foundation supporting everything from steel mills to chemical plants to car factories. Reliable, affordable, taken for granted. For years, Russia supplied the fuel that kept Germany's industrial heart beating. Natural gas flowed west, prices stayed low, and production costs remained competitive. The relationship was framed as rational, mutual, and stable. Germany needed energy. Russia needed revenue. Everyone benefited, or so it seemed. Slowly, dependency became normal. Energy security was rebranded as economic partnership. Political risk was dismissed as exaggerated. After all, why would anyone disrupt a relationship that worked so well? Germany bet heavily on the idea that trade discourages conflict, that markets calm politics, that rational self-interest always wins. That belief shaped policy decisions with enormous consequences. Nuclear power was phased out. Domestic energy capacity shrank. Entire industrial sectors expanded under the assumption that cheap gas would always be available. The question, what if it isn't, was quietly pushed aside because answering it would mean redesigning the entire economic model. When geopolitical tensions rose, Germany hesitated. Questioning energy dependence meant questioning industrial identity. So warnings were softened, transitions delayed, contingency plans postponed. The gas kept flowing, reinforcing the illusion that caution had been justified, until it didn't. When energy prices exploded, the shock rippled through the economy with brutal speed. Factories that had been profitable for decades suddenly faced impossible cost structures. Production wasn't slowed by falling demand, but by unaffordable inputs. Companies weren't losing customers. They were losing viability. What shocked many was not just the scale of the damage, but how quickly it spread. Energy wasn't just another cost. It was a cost. Once it rose, everything else followed. Prices, inflation, uncertainty, fear. Germany discovered, almost overnight, that its legendary resilience had a critical weakness. The system had been optimized for efficiency, not disruption. It worked beautifully when conditions were stable. It struggled the moment they weren't. Energy, once invisible, became the center of every economic conversation. And with that realization came a harder truth. Germany had built its industrial strength on something it never truly controlled. The foundation didn't collapse, but it shifted. And when foundations move, even strong structures begin to creak. Germany's economy was never powered by consumption. It was powered by confidence abroad. The world bought German cars, machines, chemicals, and tools because they were reliable, precise, and worth the price. Exports were not a sector. They were the system. For decades, this engine ran smoothly. Globalization expanded markets. China absorbed industrial goods at astonishing scale. Europe integrated supply chains. The euro kept German exports competitively priced. As long as the world kept buying, Germany kept growing. But export-driven models are vulnerable in ways domestic economies aren't. They depend on other people's growth, other people's politics, other people's stability. When global demand slows, exporters feel it first. And Germany felt it quietly, then all at once. China began buying less and producing more internally. Global trade became less predictable. Supply chains fractured. Competition intensified from countries that moved faster and adapted quicker. Meanwhile, German products grew more expensive, not because quality declined, but because costs rose. Energy, labor shortages, regulation, aging infrastructure, each added friction. German firms, designed for long-term planning and incremental change, struggled to pivot at the speed required. Orders didn't vanish overnight. They thinned. Backlogs shrank. confidence slipped. The export engine didn't explode. It sputtered. And in a system built around constant motion, sputtering was enough to cause alarm. What made this moment dangerous was not the decline itself, but how exposed it made the system. When exports slow, everything feels it: employment, tax revenue, investment, political stability. Germany had built prosperity on the assumption that global demand would always return. This time, the recovery was slower, more uncertain. And for the first time in decades, Germany had to confront a question it rarely asked. What the world doesn't need us the way it used to? The answer wasn't clear, but the discomfort was. The first warnings came quietly, wrapped in careful language. Temporary adjustments, strategic pauses, market uncertainty. But behind closed doors, something far more serious was unfolding. Germany's industrial core was losing its cost advantage. Chemical plants reduced output. Steelmakers questioned long-term viability. Automakers delayed investments they once rushed to make. These weren't speculative startups reacting to hype cycles. These were institutions that had survived wars, reunification, and financial crises. When they hesitated, it mattered. On factory floors, the mood changed. Reduced hours replaced overtime. Hiring froze. Apprentices worried about future placements. For a country built on industrial pride and predictable careers, uncertainty cut deep. The unspoken promise, work hard, follow the rules, and stability will follow, felt suddenly fragile. This wasn't mass unemployment. Not yet. It was something more unsettling. Doubt. Managers questioned expansion plans. Workers questioned security. Local economies built around single employers felt exposed. The social contract that had held Germany together began to strain, not because it was broken, but because it was no longer guaranteed. What made this moment uniquely dangerous was timing. Industry was hurting just as energy costs rose, demographics tightened, and global demand softened. Each problem amplified the others. There was no single lever to pull, no quick fix to apply. Germany had weathered crises before, but this felt different. This felt structural. The pain was not catastrophic, but it was persistent. And persistence, more than shock, is what forces systems to change. The question now was no longer whether Germany faced trouble. It was whether its model could adapt fast enough to survive it. When the strain reached a level that markets could no longer quietly absorb, the German state stepped forward. It always had. One of the defining features of Germany's economic system was a belief that government existed not to replace markets, but to stabilize them when they wobbled. This time, the wobble felt dangerously close to fracture. Subsidies flowed. Energy price caps were introduced. Emergency relief packages expanded with breathtaking speed. Billions were mobilized to shield households from inflation and firms from collapse. On paper, it worked. Production didn't vanish overnight. Unemployment stayed relatively low. Social unrest remained contained. But these measures were not a solution. They were a pause button. The state could soften the shock, but it couldn't reverse the underlying math. High energy costs didn't disappear. They were redistributed. Companies remained uncompetitive. They were just temporarily protected. The government became a financial cushion for an economy that could no longer cushion itself. This shift came at a price. Public debt climbed. Fiscal rules were bent, then stretched. Temporary programs lingered far longer than planned. The political language remained calm, but the financial reality grew heavier with each passing month. More troubling was the precedent being set. Once the state steps in to support one sector, others expect the same. The boundary between market correction and permanent support blurred. Germany, long proud of its fiscal discipline, found itself navigating an uncomfortable contradiction. Preserving stability now meant spending aggressively, while long-term stability depended on restraint. Behind the scenes, policymakers understood the dilemma. They weren't managing a recession. They were managing a transformation they hadn't fully planned for. Every euro spent bought time, but also postponed hard decisions. And time, in this case, was not neutral. Each delay made adaptation harder. Each subsidy reduced pressure to change. The state was holding the structure together, but the cracks were still there, quietly widening. The question was no longer whether Germany could afford intervention. It was whether it could afford not to change. Chapter 6. Demographics close in. Even if energy had stabilized and exports had rebounded, Germany faced a problem no stimulus package could fix. Its workforce was getting older, fast. For decades, demographics were treated as a distant concern. Economists warned. Charts were published. Committees were formed. But the factories kept running, and the tax base held strong. So urgency faded. Aging, like infrastructure decay, was something to be managed slowly. Then suddenly, it wasn't slow anymore. Skilled workers retired in waves. Entire cohorts exited the labor market. Replacement rates fell short. Vocational pipelines thinned. Immigration helped, but integration took time, and productivity gains lagged behind expectations. Germany wasn't running out of people. It was running out of the right people at the right speed. An aging workforce changed everything. Labor became scarcer and more expensive. Fewer hours were worked. Pension obligations grew heavier. Healthcare costs rose. The model that once thrived on efficiency now faced biological limits it couldn't negotiate with. This demographic pressure magnified every other weakness. High energy costs hurt more when fewer workers were available to offset them with productivity. Slowing exports mattered more when domestic demand couldn't fully compensate. Fiscal stress deepened as fewer workers supported more retirees. Germany's economic model had assumed continuity. Skills would pass smoothly from one generation to the next. Output would grow steadily. Contributions would cover obligations. That assumption no longer held. What made this especially destabilizing was its permanence. Energy shocks can ease. Markets can recover. Demographics don't reverse quickly. The timeline was measured in decades, not quarters. Germany was not facing a labor shortage. It was facing a structural shift in how work, productivity, and growth would function. And the old model had never been designed for that reality. Germany was brilliant at perfecting what already existed. Its strength lay in refinement, optimization, and precision. Incremental improvement was elevated to an art form. For a long time, that approach delivered extraordinary results. But the world changed. Innovation stopped being linear. Software rewrote industries. Data accelerated decision-making. Platforms replaced pipelines. Speed mattered as much as quality. And in this new environment, Germany's greatest strengths became constraints. Digital infrastructure lagged behind peers. Bureaucracy slowed experimentation. Risk aversion discouraged rapid failure. While factories remained world-class, the digital layer that increasingly defined competitiveness was thin. Startups struggled to scale. Talent gravitated elsewhere. This gap wasn't fatal on its own, but combined with rising costs, aging workers, and global uncertainty, it became critical. Modern economies don't just compete on what they make, but on how fast they adapt. Germany adapted carefully. The world adapted quickly. The contrast grew harder to ignore. Companies reliant on software-driven optimization pulled ahead. Supply chains became smarter elsewhere. New industries emerged without German leadership. The export machine, once dominant, began to look narrowly specialized. What was once a virtue, stability, now risked becoming inertia. Germany still had immense strengths, skills, capital, trust, but innovation no longer waited for consensus. It rewarded speed, flexibility, and tolerance for failure. And those were qualities Germany's system struggled to produce at scale. The cracks were no longer hidden in spreadsheets or policy debates. They were visible in missed opportunities. And as the pace of global change accelerated, Germany faced a sobering realization. Adapting slowly in a fast world is not caution, it's risk. Economic systems do not run on numbers alone. They run on belief. Belief that investments will pay off. Belief that rules will remain predictable. Belief that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan for it. When that belief weakens, even strong economies begin to wobble. Germany reached that point quietly. Investors didn't flee in panic. They hesitated. Expansion plans were delayed. New factories were reconsidered. Some production quietly shifted abroad, not because Germany was collapsing, but because certainty was capital, like water, flows where resistance is lowest, and Germany's environment began to feel heavier. International perception shifted as well. Germany was no longer seen as an unstoppable industrial engine, but as a cautious giant weighed down by its own complexity. Still powerful, still wealthy, but slower, less decisive, more uncertain. This change in confidence mattered as much as any hard data. Once companies begin planning around risk rather than opportunity, growth narrows, innovation slows, talent looks elsewhere. The economy becomes defensive rather than ambitious. At home, the mood darkened. Businesses complained more openly. Workers grew anxious. Political debates sharpened. The calm pragmatism that once defined Germany's economic culture gave way to visible tension. Not anger, but unease. Confidence does not collapse suddenly. It thins. And when it thins, systems that rely on long-term trust struggle to function as designed. Germany hadn't lost control of its economy, but it had lost the unquestioned faith that once sustained it. The day Germany's economic model cracked was not marked by a crash or a collapse. There was no single moment, no dramatic failure. Instead, there was a realization, a collective understanding that the old assumptions no longer fit the world as it was. Cheap energy was never guaranteed. Global demand was never permanent. Stability was never automatic. What Germany had built was not wrong. It was incomplete. The model had been designed for a world predictable trade, stable geopolitics, and gradual change. That world no longer existed. Once exposed, these assumptions could not be unlearned. Policymakers, business leaders, and citizens alike began to see the system differently, not as a machine that simply needed restarting, but as a structure requiring redesign. This realization was uncomfortable. It challenged decades of confidence. It questioned long-held choices. It forced Germany to confront the cost of caution and the limits of optimization. Yet there was also clarity in exposure. Problems once treated as temporary were finally recognized as structural. The conversation shifted, not toward panic, but toward honesty. Germany still possessed enormous strengths: a skilled workforce, deep capital markets, social cohesion, institutional trust. These did not vanish when a model cracked. They became the raw materials for whatever came next. The danger was not decline. The danger was pretending nothing had changed. Germany now stands at a crossroads it avoided for years, not between success and failure, but between adaptation and slow erosion. The choice is not dramatic. It is technical, political, and deeply uncomfortable. Reinvention will require trade-offs: faster energy transitions, more flexible labor markets, greater tolerance for risk, investment in digital capacity, hard decisions about what to protect and what to let go. None of this comes easily to a system built on consensus and caution. Change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty challenges the very culture that once made Germany successful. But drift carries its own cost. Without reinvention, the economy will not collapse. It will age. Productivity will flatten. Influence will fade. Germany will remain wealthy, but less central, stable, but diminished. The cracking of the model was not an ending. It was a signal. Germany's future will not be decided by what it preserves from the past, but by what it dares to redesign. The same discipline that once perfected industry must now be applied to transformation. The question is no longer whether Germany can survive. It can. The question is whether it can change fast enough to matter in a world that no longer waits.